Welcome to the Quest Forums channel, and in today's video I'm going to do something a little bit different. If you've been following along with what I've been doing here, you know that I write a companion article to go with each of these videos, and usually they track pretty closely. But for this entry, I was doing something where I was focusing on two errors that Christians can possibly make in regards to sharing the gospel. And in the article, I focused on the one that I tend to make. But in this video, I'm going to focus on what I consider to be that opposite. I'm going to focus more on that. And so in the first place, what I was aiming at myself and people like me that tend to be of kind of a philosophical bent and focused on the theology and apologetics, that sort of thing, is that we cannot convince ourselves. We have to avoid the belief that we can make a purely logical argument that'll convince people of the truth of Christianity beyond a shadow of a doubt and in a way that they have no way to object to what we're teaching. Because that can kind of be my approach, and it's approach I've seen in some others as well, is just thinking that we can talk it out and prove what it is that we believe. But it doesn't work that way. It's a heart matter as well. It requires that people have their hearts in the right place to be receptive to the gospel, and we cannot make that happen. We can talk into a situation and hope that we're going to say something that will be part of the conversation that they're already having within themselves and maybe have an effect on them then, or that we can plant a seed that will make an impact later, but it ultimately relies upon God and it relies upon them seeing the need that they have. And until then, until they reach that point where they are open to hearing what we have to say, then the idea of God on a cross is just going to be offensive and foolish to them. It's not something that's going to make sense to them the way that it does to us, the way that we've come to realize that that's an expression of God's wisdom and of his love. And that's what Christians know the cross to be. But to the world, that doesn't make sense. We need to be aware of that in our conversations with them, and we can't expect our conversations to just be an absolute proof that's going to put them in a position where they can't challenge what we have to say. Because if their hearts aren't there, that's just not what's going to happen. And we need to be mindful of that fact. But the opposite concern has to do with some information that I found out recently looking at a study from Barna and looking at a study that they did of people's attitudes towards evangelism, Christians' attitudes towards evangelism. And they looked at a number of age groups, but in particular, looking at the way that millennial Christians approach it, there was some worrisome data. Now, in the first place, there were some good points. The fact that 90+% of millennial Christians believe that a relationship with Christ is the most valuable thing that a person could have. That's great. That's what we want to hear. And surprisingly, even, and very encouraging, was the fact that over 70% of millennial Christians say that they are prepared to answer people's questions about their faith. That's actually higher than older age groups. And so maybe it's overconfidence, but I do like to think that they actually feel prepared, that they've had multicultural experiences that put them in a place where they've really thought through what they believe and they're ready to share it when they're asked to do so. But the problem comes in that last part, in being asked to do so, because about half of millennials think that that's the only time when they should say anything, that it is not right for them. And not just that they're unprepared to, but that it is actually morally wrong to try to convince someone to leave their old religion behind in order to become a Christian. And so, in other words, this is half of millennial Christians, at least as part of this survey, who are saying that it's wrong to evangelize. And I think, first of all, I will just say explicitly that's wrong. And just put that there. I'm going to be diving into that. But I think part of the reason why they're making this error has to do with what I was talking about previously. The knowledge that you cannot convince someone into becoming a Christian just on purely human resources. That's not possible, that it requires movement on God's part. It requires openness on the other person's part. And so they're looking at it and saying maybe, well, if I'm not going to be able to convince them, then there's no point. I should just wait for them to want to come to me. And so I think that's part of the thinking. Another part that's also very evident and very dangerous is responding to a cultural message, to our culture telling us constantly that every path to God is equally valid, which ultimately boils down to just saying that there is no God, is really where that comes from, and that it's all a joke, and that everybody can just believe whatever they want because it doesn't count for anything. That's really where that message is coming from. But even for the few people who do think they believe this sincerely, they're in error also. Not every path does lead to God. Christians should know that above all other people. We're the ones who had our Savior say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. There's only the way to heaven through Jesus, or the way to judgment, to hell. That this is the path that God has provided. This is the road that He wants us walking. And if we refuse it, then we'll be held responsible. I know that's not a very comfortable message, but it is the one that we've been sent to tell. And being unwilling to do so is responding to culture rather than responding to God. It's doing what the world tells us rather than what the Lord tells us. That's not the side that we should be on. We have to be willing to be countercultural. And again, this is what we are called to do. Christianity is not just about responding to people's curiosity. As important as that is, that's a necessary element. But it is also about speaking beforehand, just speaking because that's the message that we're bringing. And Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 10, and I'll read Romans chapter 10, verses 14 through 17 here just to make that point. He asks, how then can people in the world call on Jesus when they've not believed in Him? How can they believe without hearing about Him? And how can they hear without a preacher? And how can they preach unless they are sent? Well, we've been sent. That's what God is calling all of us to do. As it's written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. But not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? So, faith comes from what is heard. And what is heard comes through the message about Christ. So yes, Paul's saying even right here, not everyone is going to believe just because we tell them. But we still have to tell them. We don't know what impact our words might have. Again, that seed that might be planted, that God may germinate later on, or that they might be in a position that we can't fully understand and we're having an impact immediately. But they don't say anything at the time. We can't be afraid to do that just because we are guessing for ourselves that they're not ready, or because we're afraid of what the world is going to say. This is a message that the world needs. And so silence is cowardice. It's not kindness. And silence is also death, because that's where it's leading people if we leave them in it. We cannot do that. Don't be afraid to speak even before you've been spoken to. That's the message here. We have to tell the world about Christ, even when they're maybe not ready to hear it, because the hope has to be that someday they will be. And what we've said is going to be there when they come to that place. But that's all I have to say for today. Thank you very much for checking out this video. I hope that this has been an encouragement and that it has been a call to action. I know that can be a challenge. I don't mean to be cruel in delivering that. I just believe that it's necessary. If you have any questions about the Bible, I'd love to hear them, to be able to have a conversation about those. And there's some places in the description where you can get in touch with me. And if you're willing to, I'd really appreciate if you would subscribe to this channel, like this video. It'll really help me in growing as we move forward and what the Quest Forums is accomplishing. But until next time, keep looking up.